Don't Starve has come a long way. Since the initial release of the game for beta testing in 2012, we've seen 2 DLCs, a co-op release, and an incredible amount of free content updates, including just last month a large update for Shipwrecked and the Forge for Don't Starve Together. And add on to that a new single player DLC coming early next year. It truly is the game that keeps on giving. And today I want to talk a little bit about the game and why I think Don't Starve has had such prolonged success as a franchise, and what the developers did to take it from a fairly rudimentary but promising game in 2012 to what it is today. And I should say before I start that in this video I will be discussing many things that I would consider spoilers and things that you should experience from the game yourself. So if you're watching this and haven't seen much of Don't Starve and are thinking about playing it, I would highly recommend playing the game first and then coming back. So what is Don't Starve fundamentally? This question is actually quite hard to answer. The game itself is categorized as a wilderness survival game, and it is, until it isn't. I think it's fair to say that those of you that have played a lot of Don't Starve don't really have any trouble surviving. So then, what is the point of the game when survival becomes trivial? And I think answering that question is the key to the success of the franchise. Let's take a look back at the game in the early beta period of 2012. As you can see, the game has come a long way since this version. Sanity didn't even exist until 2013. The 2 playable characters had none of their own traits, the UI has been completely redone, and you couldn't even build a spear in the first version of the game. But despite all that, the core mechanics of the game were still present. You spawn into the world and have to survive with what you can find. You encounter challenges and either overcome those challenges, find a way to escape them, or die and try again. For example, one of the first challenges newcomers face is, believe it or not, starvation. Players either learn to grow or manufacture sustainable sources of food, or they might choose to live day by day foraging what they can find, or they may die and hopefully learn from their mistakes. And this same concept can be applied to creatures you find and darkness at nighttime. Admittedly, the earliest versions of Don't Starve were fairly easy to survive in once you knew how to actually play the game, but it was with the content updates that would follow that not only added some life and color to the game, but also made it significantly harder to survive. In the next 6 months, Klei would bring out 14 updates, and that's not including all the hotfixes and patches. In these updates, there was the addition of hounds, birds, Krampus, tall birds, spider queens, spider warriors, walruses, deerclops, rain, winter, food spoilage, 5 new characters, and so many other things that I haven't mentioned. All of a sudden, surviving had a lot more to it than just gathering food and making fire at night. I think it's roughly at this point, after 6 months of continuous updates, where Don't Starve takes a turn. And this coincides with the completion of Adventure Mode. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Adventure Mode, it's essentially a challenge mode superimposed on the normal sandbox game. One or a few key challenges will be the focus of each chapter of the game mode, and the player needs to survive long enough to gather 4 components and put them together to advance to the next chapter, of which there are 5 in total. Completing the final chapter will reveal some aspects of the lore of the game and also unlock Maxwell as a playable character. But I think in some ways Adventure Mode ended up being what Don't Starve was trying to be initially. If you look at some of the other games Klei has made around the time of Don't Starve, you look at games like Mark of the Ninja and Invisible Ink. At their cores, they're challenging games, with a campaign that ranges from a few hours to around a dozen, depending on the difficulty level you choose, and there are elements of a story throughout each of those games, although in my opinion the gameplay is the main focus. And this is quite similar to Adventure Mode in Don't Starve. It takes around 10 to 20 hours to complete depending on how well you fare, and of course this is not including failed attempts in which you would have to start again from the beginning. There are elements of story throughout the mode, but the main and ultimate focus is still on the gameplay and on surviving. So here we have a wilderness survival game that's almost hidden away from the rest of the game, which has now become more of a sandbox adventure game as a result of all the updates. And keep in mind, Don't Starve would still be a challenging survival game for newcomers, but over the next several updates you start seeing a trend. Less and less of the updates make the game more difficult right off the bat, and instead aim to give the experienced player more of a challenge in the late game, or more to do. And I cannot make this point any better than with the update that immediately follows the completion of Adventure Mode. What is that update, you ask? Caves. I remember when I first saw a YouTuber doing a Let's Play series on Don't Starve at least 3 years ago now. I was still trying to get a feel for the game and get some tips on how to survive a bit better, and this guy I was watching, for the life of me I can't remember the name of the channel. I don't think he makes videos anymore. Anyway, this guy, he's a pro. He knows what he's doing. Surviving is no problem. He's even got a nice little base set up, and then I see him mine a plugged sinkhole and jump down into the caves, and I was just like, whoa. This game is way more complex than I thought it was. And I remember straight away I messaged Speedy, he's the guy I play Don't Starve together with, and I said, dude, have a look at this. For me, this changed the game completely. Up until this point, the vast majority of challenges you face in the game are compulsory ones. No matter what you do, it gets dark at night time. Hounds are going to come every handful of days. It's going to get cold in the winter. But this challenge was completely voluntary. If you didn't want to go in the caves, you don't have to. You can spend your entire life living peacefully as a dragon fruit farmer on the surface, and nothing from down there will ever come up to bother you. And this is where I think the purpose of the game shifted from being purely surviving to what you do once you know how to survive. And those two concepts can be categorized as the early game and the late game. For most people, the early game is the initial setting up of a base and putting in place systems that will keep you well fed, safe from attacks, and protected from the weather and other events. And depending on how advanced a player is, this will also involve getting certain items such as a tam, walking cane, moggles, and a Krampus sack to make life easier. The late game is when the player feels comfortable enough to take on more difficult bosses, venture into the caves and ruins, or just build a mega base, depending on what they feel like doing. And granted, this system of early game and late game is not a new concept, and a lot of games in this genre have similar kinds of systems. Games like Terraria, Subnautica, and even Minecraft, which was a key influence for the developers of Don't Starve. But I think it's interesting that the game was originally solely a survival game and almost fell into a sandbox genre unintentionally. Whether this was the grand design of Don't Starve all along, I'm not sure, but I'm glad it did go down that route. The only real times when I felt that the updates were made with the intention of making the early game more difficult were with the introduction of the Reign of Giants and Shipwrecked DLCs. And this was mostly because the new environment was just unfamiliar to players. I personally believe that Shipwrecked has the most challenging early game of the two DLCs, and I've expressed this opinion many times in my Let's Play series, but it also has a far weaker late game in the sense that there's not a whole lot to do besides base building once you've survived a year. And I think the developers tried to address this with the most recent content update, but if base building isn't your thing, then it still doesn't help all that much. In the next part of the video, I want to focus a bit on Don't Starve Together, which I feel is the more substantial and refined game of the two. I still find it interesting to think that originally the game wasn't going to happen, and the developers even said this, but ended up making it anyway. Unlike Don't Starve Together started as a practically complete game. Within a few months of initial bug fixes and the implementation of the Reign of Giants DLC into the game, it was essentially a multiplayer version of the single player game. I started playing Don't Starve Together at the point where it left the closed beta in early 2015, and most of that year was dedicated to minor changes, bug fixes, and UI tweaks, probably while the team was working on Shipwrecked, which would come out at the end of the year. In fact, right up until mid-2016, there wasn't a whole lot to differentiate the co-op and single-player games, with some of the most notable differences being beefalo domestication in Don't Starve Together, and the caves and ruins biomes appearing together only one level down, as opposed to being on separate levels in the single-player version of the game. Don't Starve Together was officially released on April the 21st of 2016, but it wasn't until the 11th of August that Don't Starve Together really started to diverge from the base game, and that's with the addition of the East or West, Base is Best update, which was the first update in the New Reign beta. Introduced in this update was the Occuvigil, craftable maps, and most importantly, a disease system in which transplanted saplings, grass, or berry bushes will randomly become diseased if the player fails to take action after seeing the warning signs. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. There was a constant stream of updates every few weeks from August all the way to March of 2017, not including special events like Winter's Feast, Year of the Gobbler, or Hallowed Nights. 5 bosses were added in this time, as well as a myriad of items and structures, of which I don't have time to name them all. By the end of it, Don't Starve Together was pretty much its own game, similar to Don't Starve, but different in many ways and more advanced, especially in its late game. A few of the mechanics brought in during A New Reign, specifically for the late game, was their disease system and resource variation. I hate to say it, but I personally really don't like the disease system. It was introduced as a way of giving veteran players that have survived a long time a challenge when creating and maintaining their own base. The way it works is that every 50 days or so, a disease has a 10% chance of spawning in your replanted grass, twigs, or berry bushes. You then have 4 to 6 days to notice this and dig up and replant the diseased item. Otherwise, the plant will die and the disease will spread to nearby plants every day or so. The thing that annoys me the most about this is that it's a system that essentially punishes players for building a base. There have been times when I've gone into the caves for summer and come back up to see all my plants are dead. Why? Because I didn't take the time to remember when I planted them, when they might become diseased, and then dig up and replant them all at that time? I think that highlights one of the few issues I have with Don't Starve and Don't Starve Together, and that's the early game challenges becoming annoying in the late game. And honestly, when you look over how the game has progressed in its development over the years, you can see how it came to be. When you get to day 100 or 500 or 1000, it's safe to say that the focus of the game is not survival anymore. Survival is pretty trivial at this point. However, there are still regular events like disease and hounds and weather, trees becoming petrified or burning, and wildfires in the summer, antlion creating sinkholes if you don't give him presents every year. Things like that which become more of a pain than a challenge when you get to the late game. I would love for there to be a way in which to stop the hounds from coming, and not like a mod or a setting or anything like that which removes the early game challenge, but maybe a hound boss that when defeated stops the hounds from coming. I know some people won't agree with me on this point, but depending on what you want from the game, quite a few of those things become annoying in the late game. I mean, if all you want from the game is to build a magnificent base, then having your berry bushes become diseased is not much fun. If all you want to do is defeat all the bosses, then the weather can be a bit annoying if it's too hot or too cold or raining when you want to fight. If you extrapolate all this out, even eating can become something that you just have to remember to do every day. And I know that's probably going a bit over the top. You can't remove eating from a game called Don't Starve, but I think it's interesting to see how Over the years of changing gradually from a survival game to more of an adventure sandbox, it's the latter that has become more enjoyable. At least for me anyway. Overall, Don't Starve and Don't Starve Together are two of my favourite games of all time. I cannot recommend them enough to new players, and with new updates still on the horizon with the likes of The Forge and the new Hamlet DLC in the works for next year, I could see myself playing Don't Starve for a long time to come. I know this video became a bit rambly, and there are many aspects of the game that I didn't mention in the interest of time and relevance to my overall point, but hopefully you found this video interesting and it gave you a bit of an insight into how Don't Starve became the game that it is today. Any of you who watch my videos will know that this is not the kind of video I normally make, and it actually took me many more hours than I thought it would. So if you did enjoy it, please give the video a thumbs up and maybe share it with someone who you think might find it interesting. Feel free to leave a comment sharing your own opinions, and I'll try my very best to read them all and respond when I can. If you would like to support me and my channel in more of a direct manner, I've got a Patreon page which you can have a look at. The link to that is in the description, and I'd also like to take this time to thank my current patrons. You know who you are. I really appreciate your support, and I'm working to add more benefits for becoming a patron in the future. The links to all my other social media are also in the description, so if you want to follow me on Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, or join the Discord community, it's all down there. That's all from me, guys. Thanks for watching, and take care.